We must decolonize our minds. You don't need Macron. You don't need any president to tell us in Africa how we can make our own peace. You know, the history of what we now know as the Democratic Republic of Congo is a history that is long and has several twists and turns. And it is important to contextualize that history so that we are able to understand and appreciate what is happening now. The Congo Free State, as we know it today, was established by King Leopold of the Belgians. That is not to say that there were no African populations with over 450 nationalities. And we will also remember that it's the same King Leopold of the Belgians who was the force behind the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885, during which the current boundaries that we know of African states were established. But during that same period that Leopold was establishing the Congo Free State, the Germans under Bismarck in 1880 had also established a presence in what is present-day Tanzania, but was then Tanganyika, and in what was then Rwanda-Urundi, which we now know separately as Rwanda and Burundi. When the Germans lost the war, what is normally described as the First World War, but I prefer to call the First European Tribal War, what then happened is that Rwanda and Burundi were made to be trust territories of Belgium. So the original sin in terms of the conflict that we see in DRC today was planted in those days, planted by King Leopold of the Belgians, reinforced in Berlin in 1884 and 1885. And there is a beautiful book that has been written by the Nigeria called Dekeye Adebajo in 2010, which is titled The Curse of Berlin, Africa After the Cold War. And it is important to have that history for us to appreciate what is now known as the conflict that is pitting Congo. Some say that the Rwandese are involved because the people that are fighting as M23 are of Tutsi stock, but they are Congolese. They come from around Kivu. The fact that a boundary was drawn by the colonialists and put them in a country that is now known as DRC, at one time was known as Zaire or Congo Kinshasa, does not make them Rwandese. So the M23 was formed deliberately because the people who are then christened as the Banyamulenge thought that they were being discriminated against. They thought that the Congolese administration in Kinshasa was telling them to go to Rwanda, which is not their country. And this is something that has been debated over time. In 1996, when the country was still known as Zaire, the former president of Tanzania, the late Julius Kambarage Nyerere, in 1996, when delivering a speech in New York under the Peace Academy, said that we must be very clear that the Banyamulenge are not Rwandese. The Banyamulenge or the Tutsi who are to be found or who are found in Kivu are Congolese. Because the colonialist border put them in DRC, Congo, and some in Tutsi, does not make them Rwandese. So the M23 was created deliberately for the purpose of protecting the interests of the Tutsis who are Congolese citizens. However, it must be understood that there have been accusations and counter-accusations, with the administration in Kinshasa saying that the Rwanda administration is aiding the M23. Rwanda, on her part, has said that because the war spills over into Rwanda occasionally, they are always on a defensive and sometimes in an offensive mode. And you will remember that when Felix Tshisekedi took over power, there was a time indeed when he visited Kigali and gave the Rwandese the right to move into the territory of Congo to deal with other rebel groups which were a threat to Rwanda, in the same way that he also did to the Ugandans. The fallout now is that diplomatically there is now a problem between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the accusations are that the Rwandese administration is using M23 to destabilize DRC and also to take resources. But I believe that if we are to look at the issue in an objective manner, this is not the time to apportion blame. This is the time to ask ourselves, how can we stabilize that area? And that will require, among other things, that all the combatants are called to a round table. The argument, for example, that comes from the Kinshasa administration that they cannot have a face-to-face meeting with M23 is without merit, because it is the M23 who are on the ground, and they are an organized force with a clear chain of command. Even if it is true that the Rwanda government has given them logistical support, that does not take away the fact that they are organized and that they say they are Congolese. And we will remember that numerous attempts have been made to stabilize DRC. Numerous attempts when it was still called Zaire, numerous attempts when it changed its name to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there have been peace initiatives, the most prominent of which has been the peace initiative by President João Lourenço of Angola, which appears to have faltered. There was also the Nairobi peace initiative, and we will remember that at one time all the East African countries did sanction an African force to go and help the Congolese administration, and they expelled the East African force and invited SADC. It must be remembered that DRC is a member of 2 regional organizations, perhaps even 3. But the most prominent are that they are members of the East African community and members of SADC. And as we speak now in the year 2025, it is the SADC forces that are prominent in that area. Internationally, we also have the UN, MONUSCO, which has been there for a very long time. And this is not the first time that M23 have actually invaded Goma and occupied Goma. There was a time when they did, but the things have escalated in a manner that was unprecedented, with the consequence that the Kinshasa administration severed diplomatic ties and asked that the Rwandese ambassador winds up their diplomatic activities within 48 hours. It is in that context that the Kenyan President William Ruto, who is the current chair of the East African community, then said, let us have an urgent meeting in order to resolve the problem. But from where I sit, such an urgent meeting will only be to stabilize and possibly call for a truce. But we've got to look at the long-term issues. I know others outside of the continent have also offered to mediate. President Erdogan of Turkey did offer to mediate, and that was immediately dismissed by the Congolese, which begs the question, how do we deal with the Congo problem in the context of the combatants who are present and who have demonstrated that they have sufficient firepower to overwhelm the Congolese forces? We talk much more about M23 and also talk about Banyamulenge, but remember that researchers tell us that there are anything between 100 and 120 20 armed groups, some of which are mercenaries and are involved with miners from different parts of the world. So that even if you negotiated with M23, what do you do with the other armed forces? From where I sit, and there are people who share the view that I take, you need a thorough examination of the situation in Congo. You need to have a conference which is an all-party meeting to look at mediation of the conflict in a proper manner. And I am of the view that all heads of state in East Africa should congregate. All heads of state in SADC should congregate. And perhaps if the AU was a strong body, it is not. This would be done under the aegis of the AU, so that you don't have single mediators. In order to underscore the significance of the situation or the gravity of the situation, heads of state should do the initial heavy lifting with certain guarantees being demanded of the parties involved. Short of that, we are in danger of having an all-out war in the same manner that we had in 1996 and 1997, when we had what was called the First Congo War and Africa's First World War. And we then had a similar one in 2001, 2003. So there is wisdom in this thing happening. I hope that on the 29th day of January 2025, the initial meeting between President Tshisekedi and President Kagame, and in the presence of other heads of state, will break the ice, because breaking the ice will then ensure that we have a path towards which lasting peace can be realized and certain accommodations being made. Finally, it is important to point out that it is unwise for African leaders to use colonially created and inherited boundaries as a basis for shutting out populations. One of the reasons why in 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and in 1964 in Cairo, Egypt, it was agreed to retain the boundaries was not because we wanted to use them as paddocks to discriminate, but because it was thought that trying to recreate them would cause chaos. It was also understood that they'll only be useful for purposes of administration. It cannot be right that we are talking about African unity, we are talking about free movement of persons, and then we begin to say that some are Congolese, some are Rwandese, some are Burundians. I hope and pray that those who for the time being are in positions of leadership in the DRC will recognize and see the big picture and negotiate. The stance that they have taken that they are not going to negotiate with M23 is, in my view, self-defeating. You know, I understand President Ruto is the current chair of the East African Community Summit, having taken over from President Salva Mayardit Kir of South Sudan. So in that context, I understand that he is reacting properly and saying, these are member states, let's have an urgent meeting. But it beggars belief that you are calling the president of a former colonizer and a neo-colonizer to tell you how to run African affairs. But all these are out of what I call colonial hangover. African politicians still hold the view that they must be second-guessed and supported by presidents of former colonizers. We must decolonize our minds. You don't need Macron. You don't need any president to tell us in Africa how we can make our own peace. This is why they look down upon us, that even the things we can do, we still behave as see as if we are school boys and school girls and they've got to tell us what to do. I hope that when the meeting of the East African Community Heads of State is convened, heads of state will say, no, we don't want France. No, we don't want all these fellows. They could be friends of goodwill, but the territory must be defined. What we are doing for Africans, let Africans do. Nyerere was so clear in these things that lasting peace can only be achieved if it is midwifed by Africans who are guarantors. And if we want any international presence in the meeting, it should be through the institution of the United Nations in which we are members, not some foreign power. And Macron has demonstrated not once, not twice, that he has great contempt for Africa, and we should shut him out. You know, there are many suspicions as to who is the guarantor and who is the person behind M23. There are suggestion and speculation that M23, of course, as we know, this is in the public domain, that the Rwanda is behind them. There are those who even argue that even France is behind them. There are those who even argue that the United States is supporting them. Those arguments are there. But even if that were true, I believe that it is African countries who should, in the first instance, examine what is on the ground. And if indeed the French are involved in some way or other, then it is our duty to ensure that those umbilical cords are cut. But ultimately, one of the things that must be done, even as we blame others, is not to deal with the symptoms, but to deal with the root cause. I know there are many individuals, one of whom has written over 20 books. And in those 20 books, what he does is to make all manner of accusations against Rwanda and against M23. And that individual has indeed been one of the fellows that is cited as the authorities in that area. But when you read some of his books, I'll not mention him, you see that the idea is to demonize Rwanda, the idea is to demonize the M23, the idea is to demonize any organization that is trying to emphasize the significance of resolving these issues as a matter that can be resolved by the Congolese. I have always held the view that if there was an administration in Kinshasa which wanted to resolve all the Congolese problems, then they would call what I call the all-Congolese meeting, at which all combatants would then be present. And in that way, you would then have the issues resolved. I believe at one time, there are people, some Catholic bishops of Congolese origin had made that suggestion. And there are important Congolese leaders who have also wanted to have these things resolved. I believe Fayulu, may have his biases. I believe Dr. Mukwege is one of the fellows who have spoken about these. They may have their own biases, but this is the time. When your house is on fire, you don't put oil, you look for water. When a rat is in your house, you don't burn the house, you remove the rat. And when your neighbor's house is on fire, you help them so that it doesn't spread to your own. And the wisdom of the occasion therefore demands that we have these meetings, and because these meetings will also help us identify who are the sponsors, who are the guarantors, and in that way we'll resolve the problem, hopefully once and for all. You know, President Kagame must be understood at different levels. Level number one, that he himself was a refugee after the first genocide in 1959. And his family was in Uganda for a very long time, suffering discrimination and alienation. And when he was in that space, that he himself participated jointly with President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni in liberating Uganda when he was a part of the NRA-NRM. And we also must remember that it is him and his comrades who are in the forefront to stop the genocide in 1994, when we now know anything between 800 and 1 million people were massacred in a manner that was completely unprecedented in the continent of Africa. So he must be understood in the context of the genocide, and that he is a leader who emerged from that space. And when people have called President Kagame a dictator, I've denied it. I've said Kagame is a disciplinarian. And his disciplinarian approach is informed by the realities on the ground in Rwanda. And remember that around Rwanda, there are also people who ran away, people who belong to the old regime of Habyarimana and who are in the army, and people who are civilians who are involved in the massacre of the Tutsi and moderate Hutus in Taharamwe, who are actually still in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And when, therefore, it is said that Kagame is an expansionist, and he's been accused of being an expansionist. In fact, he, together with President Yoweri Museveni, have been accused of wanting to create what is called the Bahima Batutsi Kingdom. I don't think so. I hold the view that what they have been trying to do is to say that we have a territory whose integrity we want to protect. You are trying to impose on us people with whom we have filial ties, with whom we have same blood, our kith and kin, but who by dint of colonial boundaries are actually Congolese, and that therefore we must be on a defensive stance. To compare him, therefore, with Putin, who belongs to a different dispensation in a different environment, is to miss the point. And the point is that he finds himself as a leader, together with his comrades in arms, in a post-genocide era, and he is trying to rebuild a society. And that process of rebuilding a society requires that one is eternally vigilant, because the perpetrators of the genocide, most of them are still alive and well, and one may dare say, may even have genocidal ideas, and therefore one cannot lower one's guard. Therefore, in the same manner that Putin is saying that people of Russian stock, wherever they are, we have a duty to protect them, Kagame is also saying, as according to these commentators, that anybody who is of Tutsi stock, wherever they are, we are going to protect them. And I think that that argument looks very logical. But its logic dies when you come to grip with the reality that in the case of Rwanda, the people who are of Rwandese or Tutsi stock in the Democratic Republic of Congo are actually Congolese. And in the case of Russia, we must also remember that what is today Ukraine or Russia were part of the Soviet Union. So sometimes that comparison is not without merit. Is not without merit, particularly when you look at the history and the circumstances. But I believe that the underlying philosophical reasons or practical or social reasons that informs the manner in which they conduct themselves is a little nuanced. But there is a sense in which, when historians write, it will be right to say that certain boxes are ticked for both President Putin and for President Kagame in protecting their very own. You know, in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Goma is the biggest city. And remember, that is a mining area. That is a mining area, and the mines that are to be found in eastern Congo, whether it's uranium, whether it's cobalt, whether it's rare earth, whether it's gold, the biggest airfield, official airfield, is to be found in Goma. It is also the city that connects you with the rest of East Africa, whether you are talking Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and the rest of the African hinterland, if you may. So it is significant in that regard because of absence of good infrastructure in DRC. Congo is a country that has very few roads, very few railways, if any. So when you move from Kinshasa or Kisangani or Bukavu, the place that you come to is Goma. So Goma is really important for Eastern Congo, which is the home of mines, and which, when DRC stabilizes, that is actually the fountain of their riches. When you take Goma, you hit the very heart of Eastern Congo. You know, one can never say never, and that is why some of us are saying, before that happens, it must be stopped. You know, when you see the M23 taking Goma, they are actually saying, we can march on to Kinshasa. And it has happened before during the Kabila administration. And it is also possible that the administration in Kinshasa will not stand by and watch them march on. They would invite their own friends as they did before. And if they did so, you would once again have different countries involved, both from within Eastern Africa or Southern Africa or Central Africa. And nobody wants that, because when that happens, there'll also be other countries who actually love it when Congo is at war and in a state of confusion. And there are countries which are former colonizers whose subterranean hands are ever present, because an unstable Congo and an unstable Africa is a good hunting ground. So we pray and hope, and beyond prayer and hope, the political leaders must make every effort to ensure that that does not happen. The decision, in my view, to sever diplomatic ties with Rwanda that was made, in my view, very hurriedly, ought to be reversed. You must retain some kind of engagement. Even in the most difficult times, you must have détente, where you have their capacity and the ability and desire to negotiate and to engage, so that you keep on talking. Because when you stop talking, that is when chaos begins. So I am of the view that every effort must be made, and there should be shuttle diplomacy to ensure that we don't have another Congo war. You know, sometimes when I listen to the UN officials talking to the media, and they say our mandate was to keep peace, how do you keep that which is not there? There's no peace in the first place. And they ordinarily say, we could not do certain things. We could not stop the combatants because our mandate is only to keep peace. So they go into the arena, and this is not meant to be a disrespect to the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides, but they go into a war situation as if they are Boy Scouts and Girl Guides, and that they are going to hand over confetti to the combatants. No, these are guns. These are live guns. These are people with heavy artillery. So the UN peace mission must revise its mandate. And I believe that the Security Council now has a duty. This idea that periodically the UN Secretary General sends a peace envoy into a war situation is, in my view, without merit. And it lacks appreciation of the situation as it is on the ground. And that is why MONUSCO has been a monumental failure. And they themselves have been accused of many things which are not in the best interest of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So their mandate must be revised. When you are enforcing peace, the peace must be there, and even if it is not there, even if it is tenuous, there must be the ability and the desire to do certain things in a proper way. And we have a beautiful saying in Kiswahili, amani haiji ila kwa ncha ya upanga. Peace does not come except on the blade of the sword. You know, those who look at the situation will ask the question, beyond the analysis, beyond the lamentation, how do we resolve the conflict? History is consistent. All conflicts have always been resolved by way of negotiations. And negotiations have always worked when all concerned parties are made to realize that arms don't resolve problems and that all problems are resolved at the negotiation table. It is the duty, therefore, at this stage for the organizations that were created for that purpose, among other things, to be the midwives of the peace process in DRC. Attempts have been made, as we already know, by President João Lourenço of Angola, which appears to have hit a rock. Attempts have been made, which have been described as the Nairobi process, which have hit a rock. And it is now owing to the escalation that we are now saying all East African countries should congregate. And I agree. We should be an emergency meeting of the East African community, an emergency meeting of SADC, an emergency meeting of the African Union with a view to finding lasting solution to the Congo problem. That is what is going to resolve this issue. And it is only going to be resolved when all parties who have been named are sitting in one room and are told, we don't want war, stop it. And those who don't want to stop it, we are going to sanction you, both at individual level and at other levels which are relevant. And if you don't, we are going to use the law to prosecute you so that you are punished for the best interests of your country and your peoples. If that is done, then I believe that Congo will begin to know peace.